All right, man. Listen. So, like, I told you, like, this is a video we're gonna react to. We're gonna break down. Probably take us like 40. But
Yeah.
listen, let's. All right, you're in the stream. Let's get to it.
Well, I think
Uh,
basically the A National OCGFC, as I've talked about many times, I think that they've transcended the traditional structures in which they initially developed. You know, the nation state model compartmentalized the world into boxes, and within those boxes, they created systems of order and control, and each box had its own economy, had its own power structure. So within the economy of each box, or what you call countries, some rose to the top within those boxes. But those boxes don't have any roofs. And now those who rose to the top of the box kept rising until they're not even in the boxes anymore. You know, and once you get out of the box, once you transcend the walls of the box, well, you see things differently. And the A National OCGFC see things very differently.
OCGFC is um. And listen, owners
the
and
global financial
hang on, wait.
communism.
Owners and controls of global capital and assets. Right. I mean, I just want to put that out there, like what that shit is. And when he's talking about like the motherfuckers rising up above the box, he's talking about like individuals, like actual people inside of like a nation who become like so rich that like they no longer even like apply to the nation as a whole. These are like the international class of motherfuckers who, and like we talk about on a regular basis, like the merchant class, as it were, right? I mean, again, we we'll get into it. We'll get into it, but I just wanted to stop and break that down real quick, just so like everybody knows, what he's talking about. Like, as owners, yeah, owners and controllers of global financial capital and assets.
Than the nationalistic OCGFC, for example, the military industrial complex. They see things very differently because they're not as limited as before. See, you and I look at a map and we see countries, we see states, we see borders. We're looking at all of the compartments of the world, the country compartments of the world. The A National OCGFC don't see this. When they look at the world, they see zones of resources. They see natural resources, human resources, and so on. They see opportunity zones. It's like X-ray glasses. They see through the borders and they see through the states and through the governments and what have you, just like looking through walls, looking through the skin and the muscles and seeing the skeleton, seeing the bones. That's what they see. Their vision is on a different light spectrum. you know it blocks out history, ideology, culture, patriotism, nationalism, religion, and what have you. They don't see any of that. So like when you and I look at a map, we might see that there's 3 or 4 different countries in the region, for example. But the A National OCGFC, they just see one corridor of extractable resources. That's all they see. When they see Congo, they don't see Congo, they see cobalt, for example. You have to understand how they see things so that you can understand and so that you can predict their behavior. You're used to the old system of decision makers being part of and being internal to nation state power structures. So you think that they make policies based on national interests. But those days are over in the West. There's a power structure now that has outgrown nation state systems in the West. The leaders in America, the leaders in Europe, don't care about America. They don't care about Europe. If you don't understand that, then their policies won't make any sense to you. And this is what I'm seeing from a lot of political commentators and analysts who can't understand why Europe and why the UK are still insisting on supposedly blind support for Ukraine and for Zelensky, because this is obviously against the national interests of European countries and against the interests of the UK. So they assume that European leaders care about that.
General.
I mean, I'm not going to sit here and disagree. I mean, yeah, all that follows.
Yeah, listen, I just, like this is my problem with this fucking channel, right? It's legit. I can't find a lot of flaws, right? Where it's like, yeah. And it's the same shit I've been saying where it's like, listen, like, why do they like stand here and promote things that you go, well, this is terrible for like the fucking social aspect of like our nation, and for like the monetary aspect of our nation. This is going to cause problems and all these things. And you're like, yeah, but it's good for like GDP. You know what I mean? Right? Or it's good for like, the the international shit, right? It's good for whatever. It's not, but it's not it's terrible for us as a people and as a nation and shit. It's going to cost us money in the long term, right? This is stuff that we talk about all the goddamn time. You know what I mean? And this is why it's again I have a problem with this fucking channel because like legit, like they're not fucking wrong about any of this shit. You know what I mean? He's like Zihan but a Muslim. Listen, let's keep going though.
They think that they're supposed to care about that because traditionally they did. But these leaders care about what's in the interests of the a national OCGFC, not their nations. And that's been the case throughout the Ukraine conflict. You know, these policies are suicide if you think that the leaders are tied in any way whatsoever to the lives of their people. But if you understand their position correctly, then you'll know that it's not suicide, it's euthanasia. Like I say, if you look at the world the way that they do, in terms of zones of resources, zones of opportunities, and of course, there's going to be a layer of that map that will include or will incorporate data about demographics, demographic robustness or depletion, you know, predictable societal factors that either contribute to or detract from stability and feasible prosperity and so on. So if you look at Europe on a map like that, well, it'll be incredibly sparse. There's just not much there. The truth is there never has been much there, which is exactly why they had to go all around the world and rob and loot and pillage because they don't have much on their own. But now they're not even able to rob and loot and pillage all around the world. I mean, if we're say like 50 years in the future, you know, 2075, looking back at the history of Europe, you know, the likely future of Europe looked at retrospectively, is going to be quite grim. Basically, Europe as a coherent project dissolves between now and 2075. I mean, by 2075, there will be no coherent European project at all. It will collapse through erosion and strife between now and 2075. You know, institutions of one sort or another will persist, borders will remain, flags will still fly, but the unifying pulse will flatline in the next couple of decades. The population in Europe is going to see a steady decline. It won't be catastrophic, but it is irreversible. You know, some of the nations of Europe will experiment with different remedies with, you know, incentives and automation, robotics, immigration, but they can't alter the trajectory in time. So fragmentation is going to intensify, regionalism, secessionism, ideological polarization. These are going to be the defining internal dynamics of Europe. Europe is going to remain only subsistently productive, meaning they will eke out a subsistence. It's not going to be entirely destitute by 2075, but it will cease to lead, and its people will only survive on the basis of debt and welfare, because the gravitational centers of innovation and the gravitational centers of capital are going to move to the south and to the east. Europe will adapt, but that's just another word for deteriorate. I mean, just over the next few years, relations with the United States are going to become more subordinate and more transactional. Strategic autonomy is going to be attempted for some period of time, but it's never going to be achieved, ever. There will be some engagement with the BRICS nations, probably especially with India and some blocks in Africa, with China to some degree. But these alignments are going to be reactive, not directive. You understand? And if they develop agreements with China, which is possible, it's not ultimately going to help them in terms of maintaining their position as a world power. They will become dependent labor and credit-enabled consumers. They'll be bought. Their land will be bought, their property will be bought, their utilities will be bought, and it will all belong to others. If you're looking at the continent of Europe in 2075, it's neither going to have been resurrected by 2075 nor completely destroyed. It will be peripheral. It's going to be like a library with no readers. This much is clear. Europe is not rising, it's not stabilizing, it's not advancing towards a future of sovereignty or strength or relevance. No, Europe is collapsing, not with a bang, but with a whimper, engineered by the very hands that used to sustain its prosperity. And European leadership is colluding with this 100%. The owners and controllers of global financialized capital, the a-national OCGFC, have already written Europe out of the future. It's no longer seen as a vital center of power. It's no longer critical to the architecture of global capitalism, global business. The energy, the expansion, the capital, the population growth, it's all shifting to the south and to the east. Europe is being carved up, it's being downgraded, it's being reprogrammed to fit into a new global design in which it has very little importance. You know, mainstream media talks about the Ukraine war as a crisis, but we need to understand it, as I've always talked about, as a mechanism. It's a tool. It's a lever being used to sever Europe's ties with Russia and by extension to China. And in the name of defending liberal values, Europe has walked straight into economic disintegration. This wasn't a miscalculation. This was exactly the purpose. This was exactly the purpose. Deindustrialization is accelerating across the continent, starting in Germany. Energy costs are unsustainable, and they will continue to be so. Supply chains are being rerouted. Foreign investment is drying up. You know, Germany, the economic engine of Europe, is running on fumes at this point. France is consumed with internal divisions and political decay. It's a laughingstock. Southern Europe is drifting into post-industrial subsistence type of economy. This isn't just the result of market forces. This is a managed decline facilitated by dependence on American military protection and the ideological leash of the European Union, and that's a leash that's being held by the a-national OCGFC. But, you know, Washington doesn't even see a value in NATO as a collective system anymore. What's far more appealing to the U.S. is to make bilateral, one-on-one military relationships that bypass Brussels, sideline Germany, treat France with polite irrelevance, you know, make deals directly with other countries. What this means is that the United States may actually or functionally withdraw from NATO, essentially to abandon Europe and to reorganize its influence, its military influence, more efficiently. And I think that that influence is probably going to be more likely to be concentrated in the East, in Europe, Eastern Europe. The future of American military strategy in Europe is not going to be centered in Berlin or Paris. It's going to be built in Warsaw. It's going to be built in Bucharest, you know, because Eastern Europe is hungry. They're hungry for relevance, Poland especially. And they're going to be willing to trade sovereignty in order to get that relevance. They're already doing it. These countries are likely going to become the forward operating bases of American geopolitical power, military power. They'll host, you know, permanent drone fleets, missile systems, all the surveillance infrastructure, all of it is going to be probably in Eastern Europe. They'll align socially and politically and economically with all the strategic aims of.
Let me keep this a buck with you, right? Like, all right, General, do you remember back when, like, we had those, like when we were torturing terrorists and shit in the war on terror? Do you remember that shit, General? Right. All right, listen. So I'll just explain it to you. Like, yo, when we were torturing terrorists and shit, when we were standing here, you know what I mean, like fucking, you know, like doing all that shit with terrorism and like had them black sites and shit, a lot of them were in Poland. Yo, this dude's not wrong, right? Like, Poland has been like a major CIA outpost forever. Like, there was a Polish fucking PM or like fucking one of their like representative, one of the motherfuckers. Don't quote me on like what his position was. He was a big wig in fucking Poland, one of the politicians over there. And he basically said that like all the shooters in the Maidan massacre in 2014 all came out of Poland. They were all trained by the CIA in Poland, right? You know what I mean? So like, this dude is not wrong about this shit at the end of the day. Let's keep going now.
It's not going to be a partnership. It's an incorporation. So what happens to Western and Central Europe in this future? Well, they become, as I say, zones of internal unrest, heavily surveilled, deeply militarized, governed by technocrats who don't answer to their own people, but answer to debt markets and corporate boards.
You awake, man? You sleep? I feel like General is.
Me? No, I'm still awake.
You listen to this shit?
Unfortunately.
Yeah, listen, bro. Like, I wanted you to hear the end of this, right? You know what I mean? Like, you know, like fucking, I'm trying to figure out exactly, like, because it doesn't seem right. You know what I mean? But I'm not sure. Keep it a beam. I'm not 100%. Right? I think it goes off the rails at the end of this. I mean, we got about like 10 minutes left.
I would expect to see AI policing, behavioral surveillance, dissent being classified as extremism. That's already happening. Welfare systems that aren't supposed to provide dignity, but ensure compliance. Immigrant populations are going to be scapegoated as they're being scapegoated now. Social cohesion will disintegrate. Nationalism will rise, but it won't lead to any revival of the nation state. It will only lead to repression within nation states and continental conflict. Demographically, these countries are dying. There's no growth, there's no future. The only option is managed decline and administrative sedation. I think the Scandinavian countries might fare better, but only by turning themselves into basically sort of laboratories for experimenting with algorithmic governance. They'll probably have minimal immigration. They'll have very technocratic rule, AI mediated social contracts, you know. They'll probably be among the safest places on earth as long as you obey. But don't mistake that peace for freedom, because they're also going to be among the most totalitarian places on earth. These are the Scandinavian countries, Northern Europe. Europe is not leading the world into the future. It's being managed even out of the present. So for everyone in the global south, for everyone in the formerly colonized countries who were raised to look up to Europe, raised to want to be like Europe, raised to try to imitate the Europeans, you should understand that time has shown us that Europe actually can only serve as a cautionary tale, not as a role model, because they never stop being savages. No matter how fancy their fashion, no matter how grand their buildings may be, no matter how much they may insist that all of their artistic and cultural and intellectual achievements are unmatched, and they're the ones who have to insist on that, the fact remains that they're actually just as primitive as they always were. So you have to understand something here. Savage behavior, and we can all agree, I think, that Europe's behavior has been nothing but savage, from pre-Enlightenment to post-Enlightenment. In fact, their so-called Enlightenment only made them more brutal. It only made them more oppressive. It only made them more criminal. So you have to understand that savage behavior is indicative not only of moral failure, but it represents a failure of intellect. Intelligent people don't act like that. Rape and pillage are not the actions of refined intellects and sound minds. You wouldn't think that about an individual who commits those crimes, you know, that they're refined and sophisticated and intelligent. So why would you think anything like that about a nation that does it? And furthermore, when you steal instead of build, when you exploit instead of cultivate, when you plagiarize instead of study, which is what they did, you know, they're so-called thinkers, they're so-called philosophers and what have you. They did nothing but copy and plagiarize from the Muslims and from other ancient civilizations, like from the Egyptians. So when you enslave instead of work, plagiarize instead of study, and you enslave instead of work, well, you don't develop intellectually, spiritually, or in terms of your character. There's no shortcuts to civilization. All they built is a facade with nothing inside of it. You know, have you ever noticed how all of their hotels always look amazing in the lobbies, but the rooms are always a letdown? Well, that's Europe. That's the West. It's all dressing, no meal. It's like the difference between a farmer and someone who just shoplifts produce from the grocery store. They're not equal. Someone who just takes is not like someone who earns. There's a difference, you know? Someone who uses is not like someone who creates. They're not the same in terms of their development. Mentally, spiritually, intellectually, psychologically, in every other kind of way. They're not the same. See, when the West talks about development, when they use the word development, they're only ever talking about material development, economic development, and so on. You know, because they have to talk about that. That's the only kind of development that they can talk about, because they can't talk about moral development, spiritual development, or intellectual development. And because their material development was only acquired through immoral, anti-spiritual, brutish means. But if we're going to talk about cultural, moral, philosophical.
Y'all listen. So said some shit about them plagiarizing, about like Europeans plagiarizing. You talking about guys like Thomas Carlyle, Machiavelli. Excuse me. Most of the fucking people who were building in the Dark Ages, like the Franciscan monks, the Greeks, they didn't plagiarize people. But then again, like, are the Greeks Western? I mean, they're not Asiatic, right? They're not like Middle Eastern. They're not Persian. But I don't know, right? In the end of the day, I don't know, right? Do you count the Greeks or do you not count the Greeks? Because then when we talk about the Greeks, you know what I'm saying? Like, we're not talking about like, Europeans. In the end of the day, do you count the Greeks as white? Because most motherfuckers wouldn't. Count the Italians as white because most motherfuckers would. The British were embarrassed to let everybody know that like all their explorers and everybody that came to the Americas and brought them here were all Italians, right? That Giovanni Caputo was the one who, discovered like Canada, right, and Jamestown, and Amerigo Vespucci is who's America's named after, right? These are things that the British don't easily admit, right, or teach the kids. Cristoforo Colombo, right? And like all these people who didn't have English names, but they were given to them afterwards. Western Europe, plagiarism. Mark's 100% plagiarized, right? Frankfurt School, most of it was all plagiarism. Locke, Voltaire, all these guys were plagiarists. I don't think he's wrong about most British shit, right? At the end of the day. I really don't. Because when, like Adam Smith was writing his Wealth of Nations, you had, I don't know the guy's name, I want to say Gerard in France, who had already, written some shit that they were using and being very successful with. Keep it a beam.
Intellectual, actual civilizational advancement as the criteria for the term development, well, then the West will be classified as the undeveloped world. Not even as the developing world. They're straight up undeveloped. If this was the actual basis for the categorization of first world and third world, well, then the so-called first world and the so-called third world would switch places. The West is the third world in terms of every metric of human development besides the superficial. And as I've talked about many times, even economically, there are large swaths of the populations in the West that are living in so-called third world material conditions as it is. And why is that? Why are they living like that? Because they never developed or civilized. It's an undeveloped collective society and culture, Western society, Western culture. It's underdeveloped. If the only way that you can win a race, for example, is by hobbling every other competitor, well, how fast can you really run? You see what I mean? If you need your opponent to have 2 broken legs and have his hands tied behind his back, well, what kind of a champion boxer are you? If you have to deny the cultural, intellectual, moral, and civilizational achievements of others in order for anyone to believe that your so-called civilization is great, well, how great can it really be?
This is not wrong when it comes to like the Anglos. There's a lot of parts of like the history of Western Europe that isn't talked about, just in general. And the reason it's not is because instead of like economically out developing individuals, motherfuckers went to war and killed people and conquered lands and shit and destroyed economic development. World War One was literally about like the British standing here and taking out the rivals, the Germans, because the Germans were outdoing them in industrial power. A lot of this is 100% true. This is why I have a fucking problem with this channel.
The truth about you was really that wonderful. Why would you have to concoct such fantastical lies about everyone else? About the Muslims, about China, about Africa, and so on. If you were so great, well, you wouldn't have to divide and conquer the people. You'd be welcomed. No one would try to drive you out. They would plead for you to stay. But we all know that nobody ever wanted you around. You understand what I'm saying? This is because you are underdeveloped as a people. You're undeveloped as a people. You don't bring civilization, you suppress civilization. And I'm not saying this for the purpose of berating you, but I know that's how you'll take it. I'm not trying to pick on you. I know that's how you'll feel. I'm telling you this to explain why what is happening now is happening. And
suppressing civilization. What is civilization? There's like definitions of it in anthropology and, history. Like these soft thoughts in college. You switch that word out for culture. Suppressing culture. Local cultures, customs, things of this nature. Suppressing it to do business. 100%. Like 1,000,000% yes. Now, he doesn't stay here and rag on motherfucking Christians. Not going, oh, it's because of Jesus and your Christianity, right? It doesn't say that. Never says that. Never says it's about your religion. It says it's about the people. I don't think he's wrong. It's like, as a people, those with a culture, Italians, Greeks, Spanish, French, Czechs, Armenians, Albanians, right? All those little countries down there in between, like the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. Places you never heard of. Massive amounts of culture. Humanity. Beautiful, beautiful humanity. Just would stun you. Food and the warmth and the language. Clothes and the dancing. These things. It's weird they never talked about. Always getting bailed out. Weird shit.
Why Europe is moving in the direction that it is. And why it is on an irreversible downward trajectory. And the entirety of the West is on that same trajectory, including the United States. And this is the reason. Because you never developed. You never civilized. Like I said, if you anthropomorphize the collective West as an individual man, and that man acted the way that the West has acted and is acting right now, well, no one in the world will regard that man as civilized or as sophisticated or as an intelligent human being. Think about it. He's a lying, abusive, violent fraud. He mistreats his own family. He never keeps his word. He doesn't believe in anything. He has no beliefs. He's greedy, he's frivolous, and he's petty. He's insecure, cowardly, toxic, crude, and unhygienic. Well, you wouldn't even want to sit next to him on the bus, much less take him as a mentor or a role model. He's a vicious criminal who doesn't even have the guts to own up to what he's done. So, I mean, is it really a surprise to anyone that this approach to life does not lead to long-term success? Can anyone really be surprised that someone like this meets a humiliating end? No. It couldn't be any other way. You know, on a civilizational scale and on an individual scale, in your culture, you admire and reward predation. You admire and reward trickery, deceit, taking advantage of people, exploiting people, using people. You admire that. You love that. You reward that. You encourage people to deprioritize spiritual, moral, and intellectual development and to prioritize material development. And development here means acquisition. It means accumulation by any and every means possible. Okay, this is what you admire and reward in your society. And so, of course, people rise in your society who are like that, who act like that, who behave like that. They rise to power. They rise to influence. They gain control by these very same beliefs and these very same behaviors, by misusing and abusing and victimizing and oppressing and dispossessing others. This is the track that you laid in your culture, in your so-called civilization, for how to attain high status and power. Basically, by being a terrible human being, by being an underdeveloped, savage, primitive, backwards, uncivilized person. You made the system for this. You programmed it like this. You understand me? You programmed it so that the worst possible people in your society would become the most powerful people in your society. And somehow you thought that once they attain power, somehow their predatory nature, which you've never done anything all along but reward, you thought it would change. You thought somehow that they would not inevitably prey on you. And why are you so foolish and so naive and so delusional about that? Because you are not developed. And we're all looking from afar, watching from afar, seeing the inevitable play out. And there's nothing to us that's more astonishing than your shock, than your surprise and your disappointment. As if you really thought that there was any conceivable reason why the West would ever turn out differently. But the end that you're nearing right now was always going to be your end. You didn't take a wrong turn. You've been on the wrong path from day one. The path that you started on was always a dead end. And it's always been one path. It's a straight line from your primordial history, through paganism, through Christianity, through the so-called Enlightenment, through the so-called Industrial Revolution, through secularism, capitalism, so-called democracy, right up until today. Your problem was that you thought that if you change your costume, it meant changing your direction. But you've been on one single dead-end path from the beginning. And now you're getting closer and closer to the end of that path. Now you've got Trump, like in those old cartoons, painting on the wall in front of you. Painting, make it look like there's a path that goes on and on and on into the horizon. That's his job. To lead you straight into the wall while making you think that it's the path forward. But there is no path forward. Not for Europe, not for America. You're not headed for a date with destiny. You're headed for a collision with the end of your destiny.
Here's the question, right? And this is like, I see like motherfuckers in the chat, you know what I mean? Like, yo, Big Boss said, like, I'm tired of Islam pushers. Fuck up. Listen, it's dumb, right? I always listen to my enemies, right? Like, I always listen to those, you know what I mean, who like have something to say, you know what I mean, that's outside of the norm. Because, like, you don't want somebody who doesn't want there to be a fire to be like the person who's reporting the fire to you, right? The guy invested in shit not catching on fire shouldn't be the guy who like fucking reports the fires. Should be the guy who's like vested in like fucking, like putting fires out that reports the fires, right? Because that guy's gonna be on it every time there's a fucking fire. So here's the mental. First, I'd really like him to tell me like what it is that path was that went through, you know what I mean, from like paganism until now, right? That created this. Now, I can understand saying this about like, the Nordic cultures or whatever, right? Like the Vikings and shit, you know what I mean? Like literally they were like looting and pillaging people to get by, right? That's what the fuck they did. It was literally part of their fucking religion was to go kill people. And like I understand that like that's a terrible religion to like carry in, right? And like making that part of like any part of fucking civilization is not positive, right? Just as a thing. By the way, House of Saud in fucking Saudi Arabia, the guys who are in charge right now, all those fucking guys, fucking MBS, all them people, legit, descendants, like when fucking, they were lucky that the British showed up when they did to fucking get that petroleum, because like, they were literally like a Bedouin clan who had sacked, Riyadh at that point, right? And they were just in charge at that moment. They had been there like 20 years or some shit by when fucking Britain showed up. Don't get anything misconceived. These people exist everywhere. But Iran and the Persians. Like no different, right? Turks. Um, the Anglos, right? Legit, you know what I mean? They got conquered by the Vikings and then conquered by the fucking Normans and then conquered by the fucking Anglos, right? You know what I mean? Like they got conquered multiple times, right? Literally, people in charge are literally like fucking, Germans, right? So the question is, right, as a whole, what was his path? You know what I mean? What was his path he speaks of? That part's the part I can't figure the fuck out. Maybe it's because like I'm coming from like a Mediterranean idea, right? Where it's like, listen, like it wouldn't be Islam if it wasn't for us. Like, shut the fuck up. You know what I mean? Like, Islam would not exist without fucking the Meds, without the Romans. So, like, get the fuck out of here. I understand Islam came to be after the Romans fell, right? But literally became a thing in, like, Syria, right? Which was owned by the Roman Empire in the Levant. And it was full of Greeks. So, I don't know. Excuse me. I just don't fucking know. You know what I mean? Like, what exactly he's saying. Maybe y'all can figure it out. Put it in the fucking comment section for me because I'm not sure. Yo, listen. I'm gonna fuck out of here because I'm getting tired and I need to lay my ass down. I'm gonna holla at y'all.